Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Region 12. Happy to see everybody here again with us today for day 2 of our Fall AIM Weekend Part 2. We're so excited to have Therese Antonini here again with us today. We have some terrific classes for you. Just a few little housekeeping items. Once again, just some reminders for the classes today. During the classes, if you have any questions or anything that you would like to ask Therese or any of our presenters, make sure that you do use the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. So there is that reminder. And there will be some points during our class this morning, just like last night's class, where Therese will need some people to either volunteer to speak or to provide some answers. So at that point, if she does need people to raise their hand to speak, that is at the bottom of your screen as well, the ability to raise your hand, and then we will give access for you to do that. So that's another reminder, as well as there is the chat box at the bottom of your screen, the regular Zoom chat box. So you can use that to say hello to your friends or, you know, have our fun regional chit chat going on. So just a couple of reminders there. And with that, I would love to reintroduce our wonderful featured international faculty. We're so happy to have Therese Antonini with us for these two Fall AIM weekends. She is an almost 30-year member of Sweet Adelines. She has been in different regions and held a variety of administrative roles throughout the organization, from chorus management, regional management, and she is our current president-elect on the International Board of Directors. And she lives in Toronto, Canada, sings with North Metro Chorus. So please join me in welcoming once again Therese Antonini and her class on conflict resolution. Take it away, Therese.
Okay, thank you, Allison, again for a lovely introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got a presentation again, and I'll just bring that up right now. All right. So my class is called Easier Said Than Done, Conflict and the Importance of the Right Conversation. So I want to give you a little bit of background on this class. When I was first asked to develop a class on conflict resolution by Cami McKinley when she was in charge of the RLC, and she said, you know, can you do this? This is something that's in your wheelhouse. And I said, oh yes, I can certainly do something on conflict management. And then she said, and make it light. And it was kind of like, oh, okay, so how do I make conflict resolution light? And so what I've done is the title to every slide is from the lyrics of a song. So when I'm in person with a class, I get people to sing those lyrics when every slide comes up. And so even though I can't hear you, I would invite you to, again, let's keep our brain in a pleasant spot, which singing is always helpful for, to, if you recognize the lyrics, to sing a couple of lines of that song to introduce every slide. So I wish I could hear you, but in the absence of that, have fun with it if that's something that you would like to do. Again, if I were in person, I give prizes for the person that participates the most. So, I wish I was there. All right, so let's begin. Easier said than done, the conflict and the importance of the conversation. So what's it all about? So today what we're going to be talking is, what about conflict? Let's look at the definition of it, look at the components of it. Then we're going to talk about some common contributors to conflict. What are the factors that put us into conflict? We're going to talk about styles of conflict resolution. And we're going to talk about conversations for conflict resolution. So that will be the agenda for today. So let's begin. So conflict, oops, back you go. Conflict, often we look at it and we look at it as being a bad thing, a negative thing. It typically puts us into a space of a negative thinking, and it can be daunting. It can be overwhelming and fearful. A lot. You know, very few people enjoy conflict, and it can be difficult to manage. So that's the typical look at conflict. But in fact, conflict does have both challenging and beneficial sides. So if we think of that, let's look first at what we would typically associate with conflict, which are some of the more negative or destructive components. So it can distract you from your purpose and from the achievement of goals. So if you're in conflict with someone and you're working towards a goal, it can certainly distract from that, take you away from your energy being on working towards those goals. It can damage the health of individuals or groups. We've certainly seen this lots and within choruses that have conflicts, where it can damage both individuals, the health and well-being of individuals or of the group itself. So that is definitely, can be one of the outcomes of conflict, especially if it remains unresolved. And then the damage to interpersonal relationships. So people who are in relationship, those relationships can end or go into a non-productive status or even a damaging status. So those are some of the negative parts of conflict. Let's look now at some of the maybe beneficial parts that there can be. It can contribute to positive social change. So when we think of peaceful protest, when we think of groups that raise the flag, for situations of conflict, they can often bring about necessary social change. So that's a big positive of conflict. It can discourage premature decision making. So if you've got someone who can kind of raise a hand and say, oh, I disagree with that, I have a problem with that, it can encourage more thought going into decision making. And it actually can reinforce trust and unity. So if you are able to come through conflict, if you are able to resolve conflict in a relationship or in a group, it can actually build strength and unity coming out of that, because the effort that you have to go through to resolve those issues actually strengthens the relationship. So there can actually be some good outcomes of conflict if it's dealt with in a healthy way and comes to a resolution. Okay. Any questions? If anybody has any questions, comments, and just put them in the chat box. If we go ahead and your question comes up later, we can always go back to this slide or to the conversation about that topic. Okay. So let's talk about some of the root causes of conflict. One of the root causes of conflict is simply perspective. How do we see things? It can be different from one another. It can be based on cultural conditioning, your upbringing, even that, as we've talked about, the foundational way that our brain works. So the relevance to this to resolving conflict is that we want to seek to understand the perspective of others so that we can assist in resolving the conflict. Now, we're going to have a poll here because I would like to know how many of you see this dress as gold and white, black and blue, or something else. So we're going to put that poll up. Okay, so if we look at that, it's pretty close. 44% see it as white and gold, 40% see it as black and blue. I'd like to hear from somebody who saw it as something else. I'd like to hear what colors that you saw it as, just really out of curiosity. So if anyone who saw it that way. So Sharon, if you can, let's see, I need to look at you up here. We can unmute Sharon and let her speak up. There we go.
I see it as sort of a sky blue.
Okay.
And a gold.
Okay. Anybody else see it as something other than white and gold? Joanne.
I really see it in more than one way. I see it as blue and black, but I also can see it as lavender and brown.
Interesting. Yeah, actually, that's what I'm seeing right now is lavender and brown myself. Okay, and then we have Is it SAI? Did I say that?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. When I first looked at it, it was white and gold, and then it turned to lavender and brown, and now I can see it as blue and black.
That's very, very interesting. So I'm going to show you the actual dress here. Thanks for people for speaking up. There's the actual dress.
Oh.
So the science behind this is fascinating. It has to do with the light behind it and how it hits our eyes. But just that different perspective, even looking at it from different angles, or the way your eyes process that light, looks very, very different. This looks very different than the colors I was seeing on when I looked at it from my perspective today. There are different times when I've seen it differently. So if you're interested in, you know, how our eyes process things, how light affects our eyes, there's some really fascinating science on this. Just look up the blue and black dress and you'll find it. This caused quite an internet sensation a couple of years ago. Okay, so that's perspective. Bridge over troubled waters, or as I like to call this, a trouble over bridged waters, because this is the idea of expectations not being met. So two groups were working on this bridge from two different sides. They expected to meet in the middle, but their calculations were off and they ended up out of sync. So this one is about uncommunicated or unmet expectations and requirements. So this is probably one of the most common causes of conflict. Assumption that other people know what we're talking about, that other people understood exactly what we were asking for, or you know, that there are just assumptions around that. So the relevance in this for resolving conflict is to ensure a common understanding, to make sure that we have a common understanding. And you know, there are tools that we can do. We can repeat things. We can repeat people's words back to them. So what I'm hearing your expectations are this, because so often, you know, we'll say, well, I told the person I needed this, and the other person saying, no, you didn't tell me you needed that. And so there's just that they haven't been communicated, or they've been communicated differently. So one of the best ways to manage, sort of keep a conflict from coming up, is to make sure that expectations are very clearly understood. We'll be talking about that a little bit in our second session today as well. Okay, just let me know, Allison, if any questions or comments come in on that Q&A, okay? And then misunderstandings. So I love this saying, most misunderstandings in the world could be avoided if people would simply take the time to ask, what else could this mean? So somebody will say something, we'll interpret it a certain way, there'll be actions. You know, one of the basic ones for me is that idea if someone's got their arms crossed, you know, that's body language. It says, but you know what, it could mean they were cold. So just taking that step back and saying, you know, just if we look at it a slightly different way, if we don't assume intent, that's huge, assuming intent. You know, this is why that person said that. They only wanted this, or they meant to hurt me, that type of thing. Just taking that intent away. And one of the most important things I learned about that intent is that when I look at an action, oh, they're not coming to get me. That's just, I live on an emergency route. But one of the things is that if I see an action, I will perceive it from what it would take for me to do that action. So I would think the only reason I would do that action would be to hurt someone, or to belittle someone, or to make someone feel bad. That's, if I were doing that action, that's where my motivation would come from. That doesn't mean that that's the motivation that another person had in taking that action. So, you know, somebody criticizes someone, they might really think they're helping. Those type of things. So just that idea of, you know, is there something else that could mean? And just again, that other impact of making assumptions. It's okay to ask, let me make sure I understand this. It's one of the shortfalls, I think I talked about this in my session the last time. It's one of the shortfalls of communicating by social media, is we don't get that opportunity to say, please clarify what you just said before the rest of the communication happens. And because of that, we read the rest of the communication in our mindset that may be based on a misunderstanding. So its relevance to conflict resolution is that you start from a position of assuming the best intent. And so then you can clear up the mindset, you can ask for that clarity, and make sure that you understood and that you have a sincere interest in the success of others. So this is just getting that understanding, making sure that things are understood. Okay. So one of the things that we do, and again, this deals with assumptions or, excuse me, the way we interpret people's actions or expressions. So there was a campaign in Canada. Scotties is a tissue company. This was a campaign, an ad campaign a couple of years ago, and I thought it was such a great example of that idea. You see a look on someone's face or something in their body language that could deal you to think a certain thing. So in this case, you look at this woman's face, and is she dealing with a breakup or is she dealing with ragweed? So just that idea of, you know, if we look at this person, is he watching a tearjerker movie? Or did he just eat spicy jerk? Could be the same expression. And then this one, she got asked to be a bridesmaid, or she got asked to be a bridesmaid again. So just that idea of that, assuming a person's expression, where they, you know, even sometimes people say, these are happy tears, to give that clarity of that. My favorite one came after I created this presentation, and I haven't been able to get a copy of it, but it was a woman, and it said, she had this look of such sadness on her face, and it said, her son went away to college, and then it said, her son moved back home. So just that idea of, you know, understanding expressions. So again, let's get past our assumptions and make sure that we fully understand what's happening here. Sometimes directors who are in the room here will hear somebody say, you know, why were you looking at me that way on the risers last night? And in fact, they might have been looking in your direction, but they were deep in thought. And so they had a furrowed brow, or they looked maybe like they were frowning. And so it's, again, assume the best intent and or clarify as you need to. Any questions so far about any of this before we move into the styles? Questions or comments? We'll give you a second. Okay, nothing, Allison? Okay.
Not yet.
Okay, great. All right, we're going to talk about the different styles of conflict, and I'm referring to my notes here because there's such important information that I don't want to miss. So if you see me looking to the side, it's because I want to make sure that I capture the full meaning of these particular styles. So these are the 5 recognized styles of response to conflict. The first is accommodation. So do our little. So accommodation, let me take that back. Sorry. Accommodation is, the emphasis on accommodation is on relationship. So goodwill, keeping the group cohesion, and bowing to the expertise and the authority of other people. This style of conflict resolution resolves conflict by accommodating the needs of perspective or others through generosity, respect, support, and or sensitivity. So if you think about when that might be appropriate, it's when accommodating others doesn't conflict with your core values. So if accommodation is your default style, which accommodation is my default style, I have to make sure that I don't accommodate and become in conflict with my own core values, and that you know, I make sure that those are not the times I accommodate to ensure that I'm not doing it as avoidance rather than when things are really okay with me. So it really is when you're not when you don't have to go against something you truly believe in. The benefits of accommodation are it builds goodwill, especially when it shows authentic respect for another's expertise. It creates an environment of reciprocity. So the idea that if someone accommodates you, you are more likely to be accommodating to them in the future. So this is, that's a benefit of accommodation, that it tends to make it reciprocal. Reciprocity is actually a very, very powerful source. When you extend kindness, when you extend generosity, those type of things to others, there's a far stronger likelihood that that is going to be returned to you. So it's a very, very powerful source. When is it inappropriate? So when it's done out of frustration. So, okay, fine, do it your way. That's when it's, you know, destructive. Tends to lead to resentment in that case. So it's kind of like an I give up. And then, as I mentioned, if your core values are crossed, it's important not to accommodate in those situations. So as we go through these, think about your own default style. We are going to do a poll at the end and see just where our participants fall. And we may ask for some sharing on that. So think about this as we go through the definitions, okay? So we're going to move on to avoidance. Avoidance, the focus is on the potential fallout, the potential consequences of being in an interactive conflict. So you will only, people who are avoidance will likely only enter into conflict where there's a very high likelihood of a positive outcome. This style resolves conflict by putting time and distance between the conflict situation and themselves. So, you know, they wait until maybe the conditions are correct for it to be resolved or for the conflict to go away. So there's that kind of attitude as well. So when is avoidance appropriate? It's appropriate when all else has failed. So you can't resolve the conflict, or in a situation that is, you are unsafe or unhealthy. So if the conflict is going to result in something putting you in an unsafe situation or an unhealthy situation, then avoidance can actually be the best approach. So what are the benefits of avoidance? It can support critical decision-making, again, when all else has failed. So if you're just in that situation where you just can't, you know, go forward, then it can be beneficial. When is it inappropriate? When behaviors and actions need to be addressed. So when there needs to be a resolution, that's when it can be inappropriate. And the disadvantages, it can actually lead to enabling, and a lack of development and growth. So those are the downfalls of avoidance. Again, if there's any questions that come in at any point, Allison, just let me know. Okay. We're going to move on to collaboration. Okay. So collaboration, the emphasis is on identifying the best, most robust, long-term solution with the greatest buy-in. So collaboration is really about finding the best fit for everyone. It resolves conflict by investing time, attention, resources, everything that's needed to promote discussion and full consideration of ideas, full consideration of multiple viewpoints, those input, needs, implications. So collaboration is time intensive. When is it appropriate? When you have that time available. So when you do have the time available to spend in conversation, in coming up with different solutions, and when all parties involved are highly motivated towards a common goal. So that is when collaboration is most effective. The benefits, the resolution developed is with multiple inputs, so there's a much higher likelihood of buy-in and success coming out of it, and for lasting positive outcomes. When is it inappropriate? When you need quick decision making. So when you need to move forward, actions are required. Collaboration when you're in a crisis situation is probably not as easy to work with, because you do need that time in order to truly collaborate on a solution. And the biggest disadvantage is exactly that. It needs time and resources in order to complete it successfully. So that is collaboration. Competition. Competition, the emphasis is on facts, strength, courage of convictions, speed, and action. So this is when we want to get to something. This will be tested through trying out things, needs a high level of commitment and candor, honesty, strong advocacy for a subset of needs, and perspectives that are highly compelling. So competition comes from that. When is it appropriate? When there are multiple options, multiple valid options for resolving a conflict. So when you've got multiple options, you can put them up against each other, evaluate the value of them. Again, the benefits of this is that you can come to a best solution of a number of solutions. So when you do that, the competition, the rating, those type of things, you can come up with a best solution. And when is it appropriate? When you need that quick decision, when you need to be able to come to a strong solution that everyone can support. When you have sort of a truly best solution again. And the great thing about people with a competition approach to conflict is once they have bought into, so if you can bring them around to a different way of looking at it, they will then approach that with the same level of commitment and advocacy as they would have as if it was their own idea. So people who come out of this default, once a solution is resolved, once a solution is decided upon, can turn their advocacy to that solution, as long as they can see the true value of it. Okay.
Therese, we have a comment Kathy put in the Q&A, kind of going back to all parties part. Yep. The all parties, that's the hard part, when a person is not willing or able to meet halfway to resolve a conflict.
Right. And so I'm going to talk a little bit when we get to the end about the difference between collaboration and compromise, because there is a difference. Although they sound similar, there is a difference. And so, yeah, there's a little bit of nuance there, but that's a great point that, you know, and that's why that idea of everybody being very compelled to get to what is best for the group is so important for collaboration. So that's when it's most effective. That's a great point that, you know, if someone will not let go of something, and a lot of times that happens in competition, right? If someone's default is competition, this is my idea, this is the best way to go, then it can be difficult to move away from that. Although, as I said, if it happens, then they become as strong an advocate for the solution. But yes, that's very, very true. Okay. And then compromise. So compromise is based on pragmatism, so very pragmatic. People who have compromise are very practical. Again, reciprocity is there, workable solutions, even if they're temporary. It resolves conflict through flexibility, negotiation, emphasis on short-term progress, and on the give and take. So that's one of the biggest differences between collaboration and compromise. Compromise comes from the position of, well, if you give this, then I'll give that. So that's a compromise. But collaboration is truly about coming up with the best solution for everybody. So it's not that I'm giving something up, it's that we have come up with this together. And that's the primary difference between collaboration and compromise. So when is it appropriate? Compromise is appropriate when you've got a lot of different sides, a lot of different facets and nuances that can be negotiated. So where it's feasible to say, yeah, I can live with that. So the solution is livable, acceptable, you can support it, even though you had to give something up or accept something that you didn't initially think of for that. So one of the greatest benefits actually of compromise is it's one of those things that can build the strength of relationships. So that idea of, this person is willing to work with me, willing to give some of what's most important to me, give up some of what's on their side. So it's very strong as a relationship builder. When is it inappropriate? One of the biggest cases where it's inappropriate is when it would present unmanageable risk. So again, it's okay to compromise what you can live with, but it's important not to compromise where that would put you into an unmanageable risk or, again, cross your core values, all of those things that, make you truly be able to support a resolution, okay? And what the disadvantages are, everybody has to be acting out of that compromising mindset. So it's not just I compromise and you say, okay, yeah, I'm willing to let you give up all those things. That's accommodation, right? That's me giving up everything and you not having to give up everything. So compromise is that idea of we're both in a position of saying, okay, I'll give this if you're willing to do this, and working back and forth through that compromise. Okay.
Therese, we do have a few questions that
Great.
come into the Q&A. First question is from Laura, and she's asking, who sets the tone for conflict resolution? That in and of itself can be a conflict.
Absolutely. And as we get into conversations, we're going to see how different conversations come around that. So it depends what your contribution to the conflict being there is probably the quickest answer. And we will see that in the next session about specific conversations, that the different types of conversations and how they contribute to conflict resolution. Because depending on what your contribution, if you are part of the cause of the conflict, or if you are someone who has experienced the conflict because of something someone else has done, will affect that. And usually the person who will initiate that conversation will be the one with the most at stake. So it'll be the person who the relationship is the most important to, or resolving, that feeling that I must resolve this in order to move forward. It'll likely be the person sort of at the highest risk, so to speak. That's a great question. And I'm hoping as we speak about the conversations, there'll be more clarity around that. Okay, anything else, Allison?
Yes, there's another question from Susan, and she is asking, is it really possible to collaborate without some amount of compromise?
That is another great question. So I would say yes to that. True collaboration has to do with working towards the best solution together. So it's not saying that I will give up this if you give up that. It's saying we're all working towards that solution. So in other words, it's not about giving up or giving in collaboration. It truly is about working together towards. So it's bringing in all different sources. It's looking at things from all different angles to come to the common solution for everyone. So it's not the kind of thing, well, here's my idea of how to resolve it. Here's your idea of how to resolve it. It's actually working together to come up with a resolution. So that's where the difference is. Now, again, these styles can work together. So you may be collaborating and there may be some compromise, but I've worked in collaborations for things where it really isn't about giving up anything. It's about, coming together to come up with a creative solution, those type of things. So that is the difference between those, is that if you are doing that, if people are giving up, and the other thing about compromise is it is a give and take. So it's not just me giving up, right? Giving something away. It's that I get something in return. So there's that back and forth that way. Whereas collaboration truly is about working towards that common goal and working together to find the solution. I know it's a fine line, and sometimes it will, while you're collaborating, you may compromise, right? They're not sort of standalone, but this is about default if you think about your default style, like if where you're most comfortable, is in one of these, as I said, mine is accommodation. I'm most comfortable saying, that's not important to me. I'll give up without anybody else giving any of theirs back. That's my default. And I have to be careful about that. That again, it's not coming out of, well, I just don't want to push back, or I don't want people to think I'm not nice, or whatever the case may be. So it is a fine distinction between collaboration and compromise. So great question again.
Thank you. Oh, I think we have another. Oh, Diana put collaboration equals teamwork to her. That's what it means to her.
Right. It's a group of people, right, coming, or even if it's two, it's still that group towards the common goal, the team having a goal. That's a great collaboration equals teamwork is a nice equation to put into. I may even include that in my presentation going forward. Okay. Anything else, Allison?
Not right now.
Okay, great. Again, we can come back to these. So we're going to put a poll up now, and I would like you to think about your default style and select one of these styles. And then I may ask one person from each style to speak up. We'll just see how the poll goes and go from there. Okay, this is really interesting. So our majority of people are in collaboration, which is really interesting. And we have no one who answered the poll who's in competition. That's very interesting. The people who are in competition are often the people who force change, the people who make that societal change, because they will not give up on their ideals and values. So just an interesting, that whole idea of the small group of people making change. A lot of them come out of the competition. They're willing to go head to head. They have no fear and that type of thing. So that's just an interesting thing about people in competition, because there's nobody who said it on the poll. There's nobody to speak to it themselves. I would like, if people are willing, if we have someone who did say accommodation, if they would mind sharing a little bit about what that looks like to them. We'll give the opportunity for hands to be raised there, and just see if anybody is willing to share about their accommodation style.
While we're doing that, Therese, we have a comment from someone in the chat.
Okay.
Sherry said, compromise may leave a feeling of not having received satisfaction in the total of the outcome.
Mm-hmm. Right. So there's something I've had to give up. There's something and it really does get to that kind of, I can live with it. Right. And sometimes that's where you have to go, when you've got, especially when there are different viable options, and there's something about it that you really wanted, or maybe even just wanted a little bit, but that you're having to give up. It's a great point. There's that little bit of, ooh, I wish I could have got, I wish we could have done this as well. But there's different levels as well. So great point. Okay, Diana, let's hear from you.
I did not write accommodation. However, there are times within a group that there may be, or someone that you're working with, where that person is really unable to see or move on with working together to collaborate. So in that kind of instance, one can creatively think, how can I help this person to get over whatever that barrier is so that we can work together? So
Right.
To me, that would be accommodation.
Right, and it's a great point, Diana, because again, as you say, creatively think about, so you really have to think about where could I accommodate here without putting risk on the solution. So it's a great way of looking at it. And again, we're talking about default styles here, but the reality is all of us probably do these at different times, depending on what the conflict is, depending on how important it is. Accommodation, and in your case, Diana, in this excellent example, is what can we accommodate on? How can we accommodate this person in a way that still gives us a true resolution to the conflict? So thank you for bringing that up.
Well, that not only gives us a way to get going, but I would hope that it would be a way to help that person learn how to become a part of a team.
Right, right. And again, accommodation does tend to be a great relationship builder. So even if it makes that person feel like the group cares more about them, like from an interpersonal perspective, if it strengthens their relationship within the group, as you say, it can lead into more of that collaborative effort. Excellent points. Thank you so much, Diana, for speaking up. Anybody want to share about their avoidance style, or as Diana did, give perspective of how they see avoidance either way? Nancy, can you speak up? Are you there, Nancy? I see her hand, but I'm not hearing her. Hey, Nancy. Looks like you're off mute now. Can you speak? Well, that's too bad. Okay.
Oh, she just, excuse me, Nancy just wrote into the chat and
Okay.
said, sometimes it is too threatening.
Yeah. Yeah, the reality is if your safety or your health are in danger, avoidance is the correct thing to do. It really is. And so I think of, people who have left a chorus because it doesn't fit their own core values at the time, or it's in conflict with something, if it's a highly competitive chorus and they're not highly competitive, or if it's a chorus that is not competitive and they are highly competitive. Those type of things are where you recognize, okay, this conflict is not going to be resolved, and so you move on from the conflict. But that idea of safety, for me, if there's a safety question, do what you can to avoid the conflict. So don't put yourself in the situation, get yourself out of the situation, those type of things. Yeah, it actually, there are times when avoidance is the correct thing to do. A lot of times it isn't, and we do it more out of discomfort or the difficulty of dealing with conflict, and that's where avoidance is not the right thing to do. But absolutely, there are times when it's the right thing. Donna, you have your hand up. Donna, was it avoidance you were going to speak about?
Yes, it was. I feel that when there is a group of people that are in conflict, chorus or not, and someone else understands the situation better or will take this under control, I avoid it, because all I'm doing is adding to the confusion, and a lot of people jump in and try to help and they're not helping. So I avoid that.
Well, that's an excellent viewpoint, Donna, that idea of I'm avoiding the conflict so I don't add to it. And taking an active decision to say, I'm going to get, I'm not going to get involved in this one because enough people are dealing with it already. I love that perspective, Donna. Thank you for bringing that up. It's that conscious decision that other people are taking care of this conflict. That's excellent. I had not thought of that before. Wonderful perspective.
We have a comment, Therese, in the chat box from Kathy. She says, I usually try to accommodate, but if I feel I'm giving too much, then I tend to go to avoidance, meaning just go away.
Yeah. Excellent. And that's really good insight. That's a lot of self-awareness there, right? Is that I'll accommodate, but at a certain point, if it just becomes unmanageable, then I will walk away from the conflict. That's wonderful self-awareness. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, let's talk about collaboration. We had our majority of people in collaboration. So I'd like someone just to speak again about what that looks like to them, what they found really effective about that, why they are so comfortable in that collaborative space. So anybody who chose that, if you'd like to raise your hand and share, that would be great. Okay, Evelyn.
Well, I try to set up every.
Oh, are you there, Evelyn? Cut out for a second.
There we go.
Okay, great.
Yeah. I try to set up things to be more collaborative, just in general. And if you have that as your atmosphere, then you don't get as much conflict because everybody kind of feels like they have an equal say and equal input.
Yeah, and it's a great point about building a culture, right? Because collaboration is something that takes more time. It takes more effort, right? To get the input of multiple people, you know, to build buy-in, to build that going towards that common goal and everybody feeling like they've had an opportunity. So collaborate, when you talked about that, you know, setting things up that way, Evelyn, that begins to sound like me, like in a chorus, for example, that's the chorus culture. Our chorus has a collaborative culture. You know, if I think of where the International Board is right now, we are a very collaborative body. In particular, Joan is an extremely collaborative leader. So that's the culture that she has set up. And when you get that culture set up, it becomes so much easier because it becomes part of your processes and everything else. So that it's a great point, Evelyn, that if you actually set the situation up so that collaboration becomes the default, then you've got those things in place. Again, if we have to make decisions quickly, it becomes more difficult to do that. But at times it's like we have, you know, it is the best way to go. So great insight, Evelyn, to that idea of setting up a collaborative environment. Thank you. Okay, we didn't have anyone in the competitive in that situation. So I'm going to move on to compromise, and I would like someone to offer their insight or share their experience of compromise as a conflict resolution or conflict management style.
I think a few people had raised their hands
Okay.
for, I don't know if it was for competition or if it's for compromise.
I'm not seeing any hands raised on my, are you seeing hands raised?
I did a second ago. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that was from before.
Could be, could be. So any insight or any experience with compromise that anyone can share? All right, Mary.
I had a little trouble with this because it depends on what the situation is, what kind of technique I would use. But
Absolutely.
compromise to me is so, if you do this, then I can do this.
Correct.
It may not be exactly what I want, but it's helping the other person come together and meeting in the middle.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, and again, a great relationship builder. Compromise is a great relationship builder. It has to be authentic compromise. So in other words, that idea of not giving up something that, or accepting something that goes against your core values. So it's important when you're in a compromise that it really is, here's what I'm willing to give on. You know, people talk about deal breakers. This is a deal breaker for me. I can't, that's something that I can't move off of. And so just that awareness of what can I give up and what can I not give up, basically. So it's a great point. But again, your point about different situations, I'm going to use different approaches to to conflict, but typically we all have where we're most comfortable, where this is our natural style. This is where we thrive at dealing with conflict. So, but it's, yeah, that's absolutely, and again, very strong relationship builder. If you get into true compromise, it really builds the relationship. Okay.
We have a comment from Kathy in the chat, and she says, I try for a win-win situation so both, all parties come away with the feeling of satisfaction.
Right. And I do think that's the idea of, you know, true collaboration. Everybody comes up owning that solution. Compromise is the same. You come out, everybody owns that solution the same way. Accommodation, avoidance, and competition, that's a little different. But the collaboration and compromise do tend to get you to a place where people, it is a win-win. We all feel like, okay, we're all good with this. So, and that's really important, that you come, you know, that you understand how you've come out of the conflict resolution. Great point.
Oh, I'm
Thanks.
sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say we do also have a question
Okay.
about competition from Jerry. She's asking, when would competition be used?
So competition at its best, when it's most effectively used, is when you do have 4 or 5 strong solutions, or multiple, I shouldn't say 4 or 5, but multiple solutions that are completely viable. So then you start looking at the strengths and weaknesses of each. You start comparing them with each other. You start looking at, you know, which is the strongest. So if, for example, say we were looking at creative solutions for delivering regional education, we might have 3 or 4 different ways that would all be great, but then we start looking at them in competition is, you know, this one gives us more of this, and this one gives us more of that. And we start really looking at the value of, that's not a conflict situation, but that idea of here are different ways that are all viable. So they're all viable. People are good, you know, people can accept all of them, get behind all of them. And competition then is really comparing strengths and weaknesses and which one most, you know, is most aligned with our values, most aligned with our goals. That's where competition is the most appropriate, is where you've actually got more than one viable way of resolving the conflict. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's all the questions in the Q&A. I think I missed a few comments in the chat box. One from a little while back from Joanne. She said, I don't really have a default. I tend toward one or another, depending on the situation and people involved, which I know you had touched on that.
Yeah, it's very true. You know, and as we go through it, it's like with any default style that we have for anything. You know, if you're an introvert, you can still behave, you can still deal with the situation where you need to behave in an extroverted way. These are really about your default, where if everything was equal, you'd go to your default. But the reality is, as adults, having worked through life, we do have the tools to be able to apply the correct or the best approach to the individual situation. So it's a great point that really any one of these is effective given a specific situation. So it's having that discernment of which one works best for me and for the group in this situation. An excellent point. Very good. Okay.
One more comment that I had missed from Sharon says, that's a new song for you. Some kind of help is the kind of help we could all do without.
Some kind of help is the kind of help
we can all do without.
We'll do without. That's true, right? So, yeah, you hear some people say, "Don't help me." When people are, "Don't help me right now," it's a good point. Yeah, excellent. Thanks for injecting that little bit of humor as well. That's wonderful. Okay, I'm going to move on. We're going to talk about. I always like this quote: "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place," and that again is that I'm assuming you understood what I said. You're assuming I understood what you said without verifying that, okay, we all understand this. So it's so interesting how we do that in terms of thinking we've communicated clearly. So I want to talk about the types of situation or the types of conversations that can help us with conflict resolution. So there are 3 types of conversations I'm going to speak about, and this comes from the Institute for Health and Human Potential in Toronto here. This is part of their theory. So they talk about the everyday, the difficult, and the courageous conversation. We're going to talk about the characteristics of those and what we need to be able to use them effectively, specifically as related to conflict. So let's talk about the everyday conversation. The everyday conversation is where nobody is at risk. So this is me running into you at an international competition. We meet in the hallway, we chat, we get back acquainted with each other. How are things going? How's your life? How are your kids? That's the everyday conversation. No one is at risk. It's safe, tends to be easy, deals a lot in similarities rather than differences. So, you know, the things that we're both interested in, that type of thing. The benefits are that it establishes a trust and the relationship in a conflict-free environment. So you're establishing relationship, you're establishing trust in an environment where conflict does not exist. So this is very foundational, right? It's that idea of establishing with someone, I care about you, before you end up in a conflict situation. Very, very powerful. It establishes that the idea where future conflict, if it comes up, the conversations that happen can come out of that space of we care about each other, we have an existing relationship, there's trust established. The everyday conversation is quite powerful. So skills and techniques, being a good listener, really listening to what that person's saying. You know, it's not, how are you feeling today? Oh, kind of crappy. Well, that's great, and walking away. It's really listening to what that person says, right? It's maybe asking a couple of probing questions and really showing that deep sense of interest. Eye contact is an important thing. And the most important thing is authenticity. So truly backing up. If you know what you're talking about, you really do care about this person. You really do care about their kids, or how this event went that they were involved in, or how their career is going. If I can put that up. You know, that type of thing. So it's establishing relationship. Timing for the everyday conversation is anytime you aren't in conflict. So if you are in conflict, you need to be a little more aware of the everyday conversation, because you don't want to pretend you're not in conflict if you are. So it's that kind of, you know, being civil to each other, or you know, going as if there's nothing wrong. So the everyday conversation is is effective when you are not in conflict. And then how do you bring the everyday conversation to a close? You keep it appropriate to the situation. So, you know, again, we run into each other. Do we go and have a coffee? If we sit and have a coffee, we're going to get more in depth about what we're talking about. If we really are, you know, I'm on my way to my rehearsal, you're on your way to your rehearsal, then we'll say, hey, let's catch up more later, and off we go. So just keep that timing appropriate to the situation. Any comments or questions about the everyday conversation? Okay. As I said, we can go back to this if it comes up. We're going to move on to the difficult conversation. So the difficult conversation is where the other person is at risk. So the other person has, there's been an action or behavior on the part of the other person that has put you into conflict. It tends to be unpleasant. It's typically more about difference than about similarity. The benefits is that it brings those differences to light. So it brings those differences out into the open where they can be dealt with. And it keeps small issues from escalating into large issues. So I had an example where I had a boss, I was in, our manager, I was in a meeting presenting a solution that we had come up with, and you know, I was going along and somebody asked a question. And instead of allowing me to answer the question, he answered it for me. And so for me, it felt like undermining. It felt like, that should have been, he should have allowed me the opportunity to do that first. So I spoke to him about it immediately after the meeting. And it's an example where if I had not told him that that was the impact it had on me, he wouldn't have known. And he may have done it in a second meeting or a third meeting. And then by the time I've talked to him, I'm ready to talk to him about it, it's escalated to way bigger than it needed to be. So that's a real advantage of actually having that conversation, dealing with the conflict that way. Okay, skills and techniques: empathy, patience, a real clarity of purpose and desire for an outcome. So one of the most important things about the difficult and the courageous conversation is, what is the desired outcome? What is the purpose for having this conversation? And what is the desired outcome? So you need to be very clear on that. So if the purpose is that if this situation continues, as mine was, things are going to get worse, and my desired outcome was a change in behavior. I wanted him to change his behavior. So you have to be very clear on those things going into the conversation. Have that clarity of why you're having the conversation. That's probably one of the most important things, and what your desired outcome is. Okay, and be able to communicate that, ensuring that all parties understand. So, I feel I need to speak to you about this because if, I don't want it to escalate or whatever the case may be, and I need for it not to happen again, those type of things. So be very clear on why you're doing this. The timing is as soon after the issue arises, where you can find a time and place that is private and uninterrupted. So you don't want to start this conversation, 3 minutes before chorus rehearsal begins in a crowded rehearsal hall. You need to find a time where you both have time to have the full conversation, and where there's privacy. It's important to have that privacy. Okay. And then how to close this conversation. That's often the biggest challenge, right? Is to sort of know when it's done. So stay very focused on that clear purpose that you've communicated. And when the conversation has included an opportunity for all parties to communicate clearly, so for everyone to speak about the conflict and how it impacted them, their understanding of it. Sometimes it is just a misunderstanding that can be cleared up. And then really work to recognize when the productivity of the conversation has been realized. So when you have achieved as much as you're going to with this conversation. So if you're in this conversation and there's no acknowledgement of what the problem was, there's no willingness to come to. So if my boss had said, well, no, I'm not going to stop doing that. I'm going to speak up in meetings if I want to. Then the productivity of the conversation has ended. And so recognize that and be able to exit the conversation so that you don't just end up going in circles. It's okay in a difficult conversation to schedule a second conversation, let people think about things, and come back together. Okay?
Therese, we have a question in the chat box.
Yes.
Julie is asking, she said, you stated that the difficult conversation happens when the other person is at risk, but it can happen both ways, right? When you are the one at risk, like in your example of the work situation?
Right. So in the work situation that I just gave, when I say my boss was at risk, it's because it was his actions that brought the conflict to me. What you've just described is the courageous conversation. So where now I'm at risk because it's something I've done that has created the conflict situation. So I missed a deadline, I missed a commitment, I blew up at rehearsal, whatever the case may be, it's an action that I have done that has created the conflict. And that makes it the courageous conversation as opposed to the difficult one. So in that case, I understand thinking I was at risk because I was speaking to my boss and could be risking my, my situation. Now, in the situation I was in, that was absolutely no risk. I felt no risk in that because of who my manager was. So I felt very safe in doing that. But it was a difficult conversation because I had to bring up something he had done. So that was that. Thanks for asking for that clarity, Julie. That's very good. It's the courageous conversation now where it's me. It's me that's going to have to change a behavior. So again, tends to be an unpleasant conversation, typically about mistakes or about a change that needs to be made. Again, deals more with differences. One of the things about a courageous conversation is that it communicates accountability. And in my experience, that puts you in a so much stronger situation to get the conflict resolved. If you are willing to say, hey, this is on me. I recognize that something I did put us in conflict and I'm willing to change it, okay? So that's a big thing. And it's amazing what that does to the environment for the other person. Now, there are times where they're not ready to move beyond. They're not ready to resolve the conflict or, you know, whatever your desired outcome is, and you have to give people that space. That's one of the issues of the courageous conversation. But it's that initial saying, hey, I know I did this, I know the impact, and I recognize that something needs to change. As I said, it tends to create a more receptive environment for the listener, definitely more than them having to raise the conversation. So better you to begin a courageous conversation than them having to start a difficult one, is my experience. And then it indicates a willingness on your part, proactivity and willingness to correct the situation. So those are big advantages of this. The skills and techniques, again, clarity of purpose. Why am I having this conversation with you? Because it's important for me that our relationship continues in a healthy way. Again, the willingness to correct, and then listen openly to the response of the other. Listen, that person may fill you in on impacts that you weren't even aware of. They may fill you in on outcomes of it that you were not aware of. And so be prepared for that as well. Timing, as soon as you realize that you've contributed to a conflict. And again, where you can do it in a private place where you have time. And then how to bring it to a close. Stay focused on your purpose and your desired outcome, and be prepared to allow that other person time to consider before they respond. So if they say, you know what, I'm just not ready to speak with you at this time, again, recognize that and speak about your willingness to, hey, well, I really want to talk to you about, let me know when you're ready. So recognize if that person needs to close the conversation, and accept that. So those are the 3 types of conversation. And I think I brought each one up separately, but in my presentation, but that's okay. Okay. Close my box here. There we go. All right, any questions, comments? So there's my everyday conversation is about getting to know each other, right? Establishing that friendship, establishing that trust and relationship. And the biggest thing being, I authentically care about you. And so that future conflicts all come from a place, whether they're courageous or difficult, come from a place of concern, authentic concern. Taking care of business, the difficult conversations, getting it out in the open, dealing with it, and probably most importantly, not letting it escalate, okay? And then the third one, sorry seems to be the hardest word, that idea of I did this and I accept that and I am willing to change, and giving that person the space. That's a quick summary. Okay, any comments?
Yes, we do. We have a few. Julie wrote in the chat box, she said, the hardest part is keeping the emotion under control when facing a situation.
That's very true. And so, and that's, it's a really good point, Julie, about giving yourself time to be able to get some distance from that initial, if you're hurt or if you're insulted, whatever the case may be that causes the conflict, to be able to take the space that you need, the time that you need to be able to get into that conversation in a less emotionally driven way. It's not that the emotions aren't important, but we don't want it to be driven out of the emotion. We want to be able to speak. And again, the clarity of purpose is huge. Clarity of purpose and the desired outcomes, being able to articulate that to yourself and to the other person. Okay, great point.
Someone else wrote in the Q&A box, they put, I found that the most difficult conversations are when the other party's default is avoidance. It's hard to break down the barrier and find a way to resolution.
Yeah, that's very, very true. And so again, that's where the purpose comes in, the purpose and the desired outcome, to be able to really communicate, I want to do this so that we can continue in a productive way. So if we can communicate it in a way that comes about, it's about our success together, and really that idea of the caring coming through. That's why if I ask this question about which of those conversations is the most important, they're all important, but for me, the everyday conversation is the one where we really establish that caring. And so if your first conversation with someone is in conflict, it's a lot harder to convince them that it's because you're concerned for that success. So, but you're right. I mean, you know, and there are times when you just have to accept that the other person is not going to deal with the conflict, and then you have to decide, you know, what's your next step? Is it avoidance? Is it compromise? Is it, for example, as I mentioned earlier, if I'm in conflict with the core values of the chorus, then it might be that I don't fit the culture and I need to remove myself from that situation. So it's a great point. You know, you have to look at that full situation and how big an impact did the conflict, or is the conflict, having on you. So great point.
And then one more question we have in the comment box is, what do you do with someone who apologizes and then says, I don't know what I did, but, and then goes from there?
Yeah, you tell them what they did in that case. So if you keep it to the action, to actually, and that it is important that it be what actually happened, not, you know, you said this and this meant that, but it's okay. So when you said this, this is the impact it had. So for example, let's say someone broke a confidence for you and said, you know, I don't know what the big deal is, or I don't know what I did. And say, you can say, well, when you shared that information, what you did was you took away the ability for me to communicate it on my own, and you can talk about that impact. So I would say, if someone says to you, I don't know what I did, be really honest and candid about what that person did. And it could come about you misunderstood it, but that gets it out in the open and able to be talked for. So that's much better than somebody saying, I don't know what I did, but I'm sorry, because it's not going to change the behavior going forward. It's not going to help them understand the impact that it had, which that's what's going to most likely keep it from happening again. So excellent.
It's good to be specific in these.
Absolutely, that's a great point. Be specific and focus on facts, right? Focus on what actually happened. One of the interesting things about the brain is if you're firing from the amygdala, so the amygdala is that core primitive part of our brain that reacts, right? We can't do anything about that part of our brain other than work on rewiring. But if we speak out of that, if people speak out of that as soon as it fires, it's potential, there is a potential that they will not remember saying what they said, because it is not in the cortex, it's not in the frontal cortex, it's not in the executive part of the brain, so it's actually not committed to memory. So there will be people who will actually say to you, I never said that. I mean, I've sent people emails where they said, no, I never said that, and I've shown them the email. So if somebody says, I never said that, or you may be running up against a little bit of the amygdala firing, and they actually spoke out of the amygdala. So there's some really complex stuff going on there. But yes, the specificity is so important. It's so important. It's not like you're always undermining me. That doesn't give that situation where you undermined me, where I can say, when you spoke up from the risers without me inviting you, or whatever the case may be, yeah, specificity is so important. Great point. Thank you.
We have one question that just came through to the Q&A. The question is, in light of the times when communication is limited, it is harder to get to compromise because the trust isn't there. How do you communicate with the person to explain the situation to get them to actually hear you and understand what the problem is?
Oh, that's a great point, especially with how we're having to communicate now. I think, again, it's being very factual. You know, Julie made a great point of as much as you can taking the emotion out of it. So when you speak, to have it be from a very calm, kind of factual point of view. It's really difficult right now. And I guess it's a good rule for right now is until you have that clarity, until you've had the opportunity to say, there have been times where I have stopped a conversation and said, I need to understand what you meant by this phrase because it's put me in a conflict. And so just as much as you can, seeking clarity and saying, when you said this, it triggered this in me, or when you said this, this is what I heard. And being honest about that, just sharing that. And that can lead to, what I really meant was this. They could phrase it a different way. They can remove that misunderstanding. So it is a difficult time for that. And I think when we do written communications, we need to keep that in our own mind, is that we need to be clear. We need to state things in a way that, really communicates what we want to communicate and allows that dialogue, that environment for dialogue. I don't know if that helped, but.
Yes, thank you.
Anything else? Okay, good. We're at the, is it 1:15 or 1:30 we were going to? 1:15?
1:15.
Okay, so we're at the end. So I just wanted to share this one listening skill. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. So that idea of while a person is speaking, I'm already working on what I'm going to say back. And so it's that real, I think we talked about the sitting in the situation and really absorbing what the other person has to say without worrying about what I'm going to say in response. Really listen to what they're saying and with the intent to understand so that you can ask those questions. Let me just clarify this part of it. So I liked this particular. Okay. And then just again, thank you very much. Thanks for all the great input, the great insights. If there's any other questions, we can wrap up almost on time. This is the closest I've come, I think, to being on time. So anything, Allison, or are we ready to?
It doesn't look like it.
Okay.
Great questions, though. What great questions.
Absolutely.
And comment, input. It's wonderful.
Yeah, it is. It's great. And again, it's, this comes from the life experience. And I always, it's one of the things I love so much about working with adult learners and Sweet Adelines in particular, is that we learn from each other. We all learn from each other. So I'm facilitating a conversation here, but in fact, we're all teaching each other. So it's such a wonderful thing. And Region 12 is rocking it. So I think with that, we can finish up this session and everyone can take their break. Are we back at 1:45, a half-hour break?
Yes, we're coming back at 10:45.
Yeah, 1:45 my time.
1:45 your time, 10:45 our time here in California.
Right. That's very good.
You are correct. Thank you so much, Therese. What a great class. Just so much tremendous information, and to use, like you said, in our Sweet Adeline lives as well as in our everyday lives. So thank you so much. Please come back at 10:45, everyone, for Therese's second and final class for the weekend and for Fall AIM. So go get some more coffee, take a little break, and we will see you at 10:45.
Thanks.
Are we done?
She's back.